So allow me to briefly explain my thinking behind this video. I consider myself someone who has read reasonably widely across the genres. I definitely go through phases where I binge certain genres, but at the same time I dip my toes into anything and everything, and I'm willing to try everything. Plus, I also think I have favourites from every genre. I haven't yet found a genre where I absolutely detest everything, so I like touch wood that doesn't happen. But because of that, I thought it'd be fun to create a video where I just recommend books from all of the different genres. I quickly realised, however, there's not exactly a definitive list of genres. Some people might argue for only 5 genres, others might get into the world of subgenres, and we could be here for days. So rather than make a formal list myself, which may not be the most unbiased thing to do anyway, I thought I would turn to those I know I can always turn to, and that is you guys. So I went to Instagram stories, which is usually my go-to place when I need help with a video, and asked for you to let me know what genres you would like a book recommendation in, whether they be super broad, open genres like fantasy or thriller, or even much more niche subgenres. And I've had quite a few requests. I haven't had a proper look at all of them, but I have just double checked that there were some submissions, and it looks like there's a few, but it hasn't yet been 24 hours since I posted that story, so I apologise if you submitted a genre after I filmed this video and it didn't get included in the recommendations. I can always do this again in the future, but hopefully there's still tons of recommendations in this video for all of you, no matter what you read, because I'm expecting a pretty broad range of genres. So with that, I'm going to dive in and look at what genres you're looking for recommendations in. So starting at the beginning, we have memoirs and biographies. So my immediate reaction to that, and I'm going to go with my gut on all of these, is Asata, an autobiography by Asata Shakur. I won't spend too much time on each book or we could be here for years, but it's an incredible look at a woman who was wrongly imprisoned and her life as a black woman during the civil rights movement in America. Then we have a coming of age story, and my go-to recommendation for anyone looking for a coming of age story is Sunset Song by Lewis Grassic Gibbon. This is actually a Scottish classic from the first half of the 1900s, and it is truly incredible. I read it when I was a teenager, and Chris Guthrie is just one of the most spectacular characters in literature as far as I'm concerned. So if you want a coming of age story set in rural Scotland in the 1900s, then that's the one. We then have period and queer. I mean, this is a subgenre I am super into, and I'm always looking for more recommendations in myself, but immediately I think of Proper English, which is a 1920s murder mystery a la Agatha Christie, but with a queer female-female romance. On the topic of romance, we have a request for a Regency romance, and I won't suggest Tessa Dare because I know I talk about her all the time. So my next recommendation would be 9 Rules to Break When Romancing a Rake, which is a fabulous Regency romance with a curvy main character, which I really appreciate. Next up we have historical werewolves, classic horror. I don't know if those are all one genre or not, but I don't actually think I've ever read a werewolf book. Is that possible? That's not true. I do have a werewolf book recommendation, but it's not really historical or classic horror. It's Mooncakes, which is like more of a contemporary queer fantasy graphic novel, but that's my only werewolf recommendation. For a classic horror, I have to say Shirley Jackson. I think her stuff is really creepy and unnerving, and The Haunting of Hill House is always a pretty solid recommendation. We then have an LGBTQ+ book that is especially about asexuality, either fiction or non-fiction. I confess, again, I've not read a lot of books with asexual protagonists or protagonists that are explicitly identified as asexual, but one I have read was Sawkill Girls, which is a YA paranormal horror mystery novel, and one of the 3 protagonists in this book is asexuality, and from the perspective of someone who isn't asexual, I do think it's a really excellent representation, and I've seen really good reviews of it from people who are also asexual. We then have a comfort read, and for me every time it's Harry Potter, but if you want something else then probably Going Postal by Terry Pratchett. A children's classic. I've got to say my mind immediately goes to The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. I was a die-hard stan when I was a kid, and it still holds a soft spot in my heart. Creative non-fiction / non-academic non-fiction on something like art, religion, culture, history, etc. So what I'm getting from that is possibly not politics, which is a lot of the non-fiction I read. Well, most recently I've read The Five by Hallie Rubenhold, which loads of people have been talking about. It's the story of the 5 women who were killed by Jack the Ripper, but it's not about Jack the Ripper, it's about their lives up until the moment they die and not about their deaths and their murders and the aftermath of that, which I think is incredible. It's basically a book about being a woman in Victorian London, so would highly recommend that. Mythology retellings, this is actually something I get asked for recommendations in a lot, and I will admit I have an entire sort of database I've collected on my blog of over 100 books that are retellings of classical mythology, and I've created a key so you know what kind of books they are and what myths they retell, so I will link that down below for people looking for more recommendations. But one I enjoyed recently was Orpheus Girl, which is actually a contemporary retelling about two girls who fall in love but are then sent to a conversion camp to be turned straight. Historical romance. Well, one I actually really enjoyed earlier this year was The Madness of Lord Ian Mackenzie. I read this for my An Actual Scot Reads a Highlander romance video, but it was definitely the standout book from that video for me. And there was loads of little elements about this book I really enjoyed, but I think worth mentioning is that the male lead is autistic and it's also set in the Victorian era, so fulfills historical romance there. We then have a fast-paced classic. Fast-paced isn't something you immediately think of when you think of classics, is it? Probably Sherlock Holmes. It's still probably more slow-paced than a lot of like modern thrillers, but I still think the very fact that it's a mystery and they're also not terribly long stories keeps you engaged and keeps the momentum rolling, especially when you start to go back and uncover what happened and when Holmes reveals to you what he's discovered. I always think that that's like super engaging, so any Sherlock Holmes really. We then have a Scottish mystery. Well, a YA mystery thriller slash horror book I read a few years ago that's set in Scotland and was written by a Scottish author is Black Cairn Point, and one of the things I enjoyed about this most, apart from the mystery element, was that it was about teenagers in Scotland, which obviously I don't come across as much in YA, and I was like, yes, I relate to this experience minus the horror thriller element. We then have a light-hearted fantasy, and I would probably go for The Queen of Aeflaria by Effie Calvin, which is a queer female fantasy story with a romance between two women, but it is just like quite cute and fluffy and cheerful, and it's not to say that the characters aren't complex and real, but it just feels quite comforting and light-hearted throughout. We then have a paranormal book that isn't super cheesy. I immediately want to go for Sawkill Girls again, but I want to recommend something different from every book, and this is also where I start to wonder what constitutes paranormal as opposed to regular fantasy. Okay, I'm just going to go for the Lock and Key comic book series because I was recently reminded of how much I loved that since the Netflix adaptation has come out, and I read the comic books ages ago but was completely enthralled by them. I don't know if it 100% constitutes paranormal, but I think it's close. So we then have historical fiction with perhaps fantasy elements to it. For that I have to recommend A Great and Terrible Beauty by Libba Bray. So this is a YA trilogy set in the late 1800s at a girls' finishing school, and it's superb. It's fantastical, but it's rooted in reality enough that I feel like even if you're not a big fantasy fan, you could really enjoy it. And for me, the fantastical elements simply exist in order to explore kind of coming of age as a young woman in that time period through a like more expressive environment, and I adore the trilogy. Anything but romance. I mean, is that a genre or is that just all the genres except for romance? Well, the furthest thing from romance I can think of is Chavs by Owen Jones, which is a phenomenal non-fiction book, and I always take any opportunity to recommend it, so there you go. Fantasy, I never read it but would like to have a go. So in this situation I want to pick some fantasy that someone who doesn't read a lot of fantasy might enjoy, so I'm going to go for Blackthorn and Grimm by Juliette Marillier because I think that this combines quite a few genres. It combines historical fiction because it's set in medieval Ireland, it has a bit of a mystery, like crime solving element to the story, and fantasy, but the fantasy never feels like it overwhelms the characters or the setting or the plot, so that might be worth checking out. A gothic type fantasy. I know there's one coming out that I really want to read called Mexican Gothic, but what have I actually read? I feel like this is the first one that's going to stump me, which is a little bit upsetting. Maybe I'll think of something when I'm editing and be able to type it here, but off the top of my head nothing is coming to me. Next up we have forever mythology, but specifically retellings that focus on one character like Circe. Immediately I want to say the Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood, because that focuses on the character of Penelope, who was Odysseus's wife, whilst Odysseus is basically off on his odyssey, and Penelope's perspective on the whole situation. A Scooby-Doo-like mystery. Okay, this one I am going to say something that I haven't read yet, because I just picked it up and I feel like it might be exactly what you're looking for, and it's called Meddling Kids, which is a murder mystery book inspired by Scooby-Doo, so hopefully that's still helpful even though I haven't read it. A detective murder mystery book. For this I'm just going to recommend a series, which is the Detective Maigret series by George Simenon. We then have a fantasy, been rereading Harry Potter again. Well, if you're looking for a fantasy that gives me sort of Harry Potter feels, then I would have to say the Nevermore series by Jessica Townsend, which is also middle grade but incredibly complex. A thriller, so a traditional adult thriller that I love is Black Eyed Susans by Julia Heberlin. It is just so twisty and turny, and the narrative structure I think really adds to the kind of thrilling mystery aspect, so that one was like a win for me. A non-fiction book. Okay, well one I haven't mentioned yet is Superior by Angela Saini, which is all about the history of race science and how it's been used and abused by the sort of right wing. Books on fairy tales and folklore, maybe with an academic perspective. So I haven't really read any books on fairy tales and folklore, particularly with an academic perspective, because mythology is much more my thing. If you want something in that wheelhouse about mythology, then I would definitely recommend checking out Lowell Edmonds' work. He's an academic who has written on approaches to mythology that I think might still be of interest to those of you interested in folklore and fairy tales, because he definitely touches on those, and also his book on Helen of Troy looks at fairy tales and folklore similar to Helen of Troy, so he might be worth checking out. We then have another request for a gothic book, which I'm starting to think I just haven't read much of. I know it's a parody of the gothic genre, but the only thing I can think of right now is Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, so that's what you're gonna get. An LGBTQ plus book in fantasy, 100% Girls of Paper and Fire by Natasha Ngan, which is about two girls who are forced to be concubines to a king but end up falling in love with one another. A romance book, well, since I mentioned some historical romance, let's go for a contemporary romance, and let's say The Kiss Quotient by Helen Huang, which is a contemporary romance about a woman with autism who hires an escort to help teach her about romance and dating. Magical realism, well the queen for me here is definitely Helen Oyeyemi, so I'm going to suggest White is for Witching, which is a stunning novel. Absolutely love it. Also kind of creepy. Romance fantasy, 100% Radiance by Grace Draven, one of the best romance books I have ever read in my entire life. I love it. Lesser known cozy mysteries. Lesser known? I mean, I feel like the cozy mysteries I've read are all quite well known, except perhaps again for proper English, but I've already said that and I need to not repeat books. Okay, I don't know if this is lesser known because I think this has had a bit of a spike in popularity in the past few years, but I didn't know about it when I first picked it up, and it was The Red House Mystery by A.A. Milne. Yes, the A.A. Milne that wrote Winnie the Pooh. He also wrote a fantastic cozy mystery, so check that one out. A fae or elven fantasy because they loved The Cruel Prince. Well, for that it has to be an Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson. Major Cruel Prince vibes. Hades and Persephone retellings. I have never read a Hades and Persephone retelling that I like. So I'm not actually going to give you a recommendation because it would just be a book I didn't really like, but if you are looking for Hades and Persephone retellings, then you can check out that database I mentioned. A dystopian book, well I don't want to go for the one everyone's thinking of, so how about Only Ever Yours by Louise O'Neill. That is a YA dystopian that very much explores sort of like self-image and eating disorders and what it's like being a young girl but in this very intense dystopian future. Brilliant. Not a genre, but something with world building so vibrant it'll provide the perfect escape. A Winter's Promise by Christelle Dabo, that has such a complex and beautiful world that I feel like I'm still getting to know after 2 books. Historical fiction, but specifically with women who love women. Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. Works in translation, well you've probably heard me mention it before, but I loved it so I'm going to mention it again, and that's Convenience Store Women, which was translated from Japanese into English when I read it. Queer historical historical fiction. This one also has some fantastical paranormal elements, and that's the Gilda Stories by Joe Gomez, but it feels mainly like queer historical fiction, just with some vampires. A cozy mystery, but this time it doesn't have to be obscure, so I'm gonna go with Poirot by Agatha Christie. Any Poirot books, Murder on the Orient Express, bit of a classic, love a bit of Poirot. Dark academia or literary fiction, is it a cop-out to recommend The Secret History? Because, I mean, it's a dark academia book about classicists, of course I have to mention it. Mythic fantasy. Oh, these can't all be super obscure. Circe by Madeline Miller, love that. Historical fiction featuring witches. Okay, this one I'm going to confess I haven't read much of. The couple of books I can think of I didn't enjoy, so would love more recommendations if you have some, because I am interested in it. But the closest thing I can come up with is also a fantasy book, and it's only set in a sort of faux historical period, but it does have those historical vibes, and that's Serpent and Dove, which is set in a sort of faux historical version of France and has a patriarchal church and witches and romance, and I really enjoyed it. We then just have LGBTQ, so I'm just going to go for Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit by Jeanette Winterson, which is brilliant. We then have Does Cute and Queer count as a genre? Because all I want right now is queer rom-coms. Well, if you want a cute queer rom-com, one I read recently was Mangoes and Mistletoe by Adriana Herrera, which is a novella about two women from the Dominican Republic who meet at a baking competition in Scotland, and their romance is pretty cute. Oh, we've got a few spam messages here. Historical fantasy. Well, if you also want a bit of comedy mixed in there, then I'm going to say Soulless by Gail Carriger. Time travel. All right, this is a little bit more challenging. What time travel books have I read where the characters actually time travel and it's not just jumping around in time? Okay, I'm going to suggest The Time Travel Diaries by Caroline Lawrence, which is actually a middle grade book, but it's about a little boy who time travels back to ancient Londinium. So I had to mention that because ancient time travel. Historical fiction that is not a romance. So I can think of some historical fiction that isn't romance per se, but that doesn't mean there's not a relationship in it. One that I would really not consider romance in the slightest is Bodies of Water, but it's also told over two time periods. So it's both set in a historical time period and a contemporary time period, but it is brilliant, so I would highly recommend it. Myth retellings other than Madeline Miller, Natalie Haynes, Pat Barker, but something as awesome as those authors. Okay, Wait by Jeanette Winterson. Truly brilliant, love that book. Dystopian again, for this one I'll go for Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. Again, brilliant. I feel like I've lost the ability to actually summarise these books, but they're all great and they'll all be linked down below. A classic, for this I'm going to go with Thérèse Racan, don't know why, that's the first one that jumped to my mind, by Émile Zola, which is amazing, super dark, French classic, just great. Fantasy, like Juliette Marillier. I don't think anyone is exactly like Juliette Marillier, she is the queen. But if you like Juliette Marillier, then I think you would like Robin McKinley, so I would suggest checking out Chalice. It's also quite atmospheric and slow-paced. More historical fiction for this one, I'm going to go with Wonder by Emma Donoghue. I love this book. It has a bit of a mystery element that constantly had me second-guessing myself, and it's about a young girl who is claiming to not having eaten in weeks because of some sort of like religious experience, and a nurse that's come to sort of watch over her and see if she is actually eating or not. YA fantasy, please. I've just finished and loved the Throne of Glass series. Well, I haven't read Throne of Glass, so I don't know if I can suggest something exactly like that, but I loved A Curse So Dark and Lonely by Brigid Kemmerer, which is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, but it's the first in a series which will go beyond that fairy tale, and it also has a female lead with cerebral palsy. Witch fantasy, magic realism. I feel like those are two separate things, although I want to say that actually for a combination of both those things, again, go with White is for Witching by Helen Noyemi, but for some more magic realism, may I suggest The Passion by Jeanette Winterson, who is also my magic realism queen. And for witchy fantasy, allow me to suggest Perfectly Preventable Deaths by Deirdre Sullivan. Folklore, well for that I have to go with Italian Folktales by Italo Calvino. Always on the hunt for chunky and enthralling fantasy with some romance as a plus. Have you read Daughter of Forest by Juliette Marillier yet? Because it's the best book ever written. I feel like I'm starting to get quite a few more repetitions now. We've got magic realism, more dark academia coming up. Queer fluff, I don't know if I've done that exactly yet, so I'm gonna say the Moonstruck comic book series. That's definitely like cute, endearing, light-hearted, queer fun. A contemporary novel, Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. Contemporary but not romance, with a phenomenal, interesting, intriguing lead character that is going through her own ups and downs. Okay, I think we've just gotten into repetition territory now. Lots of requests for romance, magic realism, contemporary, all things I think I have covered at this point. Plus you don't know it from my smooth editing, but this video is cut out twice now, and I tried to screen record all of the Instagram like stories requests so that I could put them up on the screen, but when I've just ended the recording there, it didn't save because there's no more room on my phone and the file was that long. So you'll have to trust that I was reading those out faithfully. But let me know if you've enjoyed this video. Hopefully you got some recommendations. Like I said, everything will be linked down below if you want to learn more about all those books I didn't really spend much time on. It was kind of fun just being challenged to find recommendations out of my brain for loads of random genres at once, because I think it just requires you to sort of jump around a lot, and maybe some random things came up that you haven't heard me mention before. I don't know, let me know. Plus if you have any books that fulfill any of these categories, let me know in the comments down below, because other people might find those recommendations useful as well. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, then let me know. I feel like I'm just asking you to let me know everything down below. I feel like I've been sitting here talking for ages and I've just lost the plot a little bit and I need to go make some lunch. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and until next time, happy reading. I'll see you all again soon. Bye guys.